Imagine being kidnapped and convincing your kidnapper to hand you back your phone. On September 4th, 2017, in Carlton, Georgia, 21-year-old Jada Gladden went to her local Kroger to get some tea and medicine because she wasn't feeling very well. As she was walking back to her car, a man named Timothy Wilson approached her and asked her if she had a lighter. Jayla told the man that she didn't have a lighter and continued on her way to her car. As Jayla arrived to her car, she felt a sudden stab in her stomach region. When she looked down, she noticed there was a knife pointed at her, and behind her was this man. Timothy made her get into the car and had her climb over to the passenger seat. He then started to drive while still holding the knife against Jayla. After a while of driving, he stopped the vehicle around a church parking lot. Trigger warning, SA. He had Jayla remove all her clothing and then forced himself on her and her over an hour and sodomized her. He then drove them to a park where he had her sit next to him as his arm was around her, explaining to her how easy it would be for him to kill her and to bury her somewhere in the park. After a while of being at the park, they got into the vehicle, and this is where Timothy told Jayla that he was going to rob a gas station because he needed money. Jayla calmed herself down and started having a conversation with Timothy. Timothy had asked her how to get to Atlanta, and he had also disclosed the fact that he had been in prison for a very long time, had just gotten out. This is when Jayla thought to herself that if he's been in prison for a very long time, that he doesn't really know how technology works. So she offered to show him how to get there by using her phone. He ended up believing her and allowed her to navigate him using her actual phone. This is when Jayla turned down the brightness to her phone so that her kidnapper could not see what was going on, and texted her boyfriend Tamir by texting him her location. Here are the text messages. I'll move real quick so you can screenshot it. He ended up asking, "Where are you at?" She said, "Kidnapped." He said, "Stop playing." She said, "In God." And then he decided to go to the authorities. Jayla texted him back notifying that she was scared. He had a knife. They were in her car, and not to have the police, if they do show up with the lights, because then he's going to end up killing her. At this point, authorities are tracking where Jayla is, tracking the vehicle that they're driving, and they're aware that he's trying to rob a station. Having no idea what's going on, he ends up taking the phone away from Jayla and then puts her in the trunk. Police officers around the area were notified about the car they were looking for, and there was one officer who was locally there, spotted Jayla and her perpetrator, and parked in the highway with his lights off. Timothy still noticed the officer and sped for the exit, but ended up colliding with 4 other cars. Using this as an opportunity, Jayla got out of the vehicle and went straight to the authorities and was led to safety. Timothy made a run for it, but was eventually captured. Turns out that Timothy had been in and out of prison since he was 13 years old. Timothy was charged and sentenced to life. And let's not forget, Jayla's a true badass.
This is Charisma Carpenter. You probably recognize her from Buffy or Angel, but did you know she had a brush with true crime? In the early hours of August 15, 1991, she was out at the beach with her 2 friends swimming, and while they were there was somebody watching nearby. That person watching would be Henry Hubbard Jr., who was a police officer and also a convicted serial rapist. He was active during 1991 all down the Southern California coast. Henry would be hiding in a lifeguard tower, and once Charisma emerged from the water, he attacked her. Her 2 friends, Arthur Garcia and Aldo Ochoa, came rushing to help her when they heard her screams. Henry held Charisma at gunpoint, forcing her to tie up her 2 friends. Arthur took this opportunity to lunge their attacker in hopes of taking him down. Now, the gun did go off 3 different times. Arthur was shot in the chest, Aldo was shot in the abdomen, and then Henry shot himself in the hand. When fleeing the scene, he dropped his police-issued flashlight, which had his name engraved on it. He'd be arrested and plead guilty to 38 counts of rape, attempted murder, robbery, and kidnapping.
Imagine being murdered by your twin sister. Maybe. This is the Duval twins. Alexandra and Anastasia, to be exact. On May 29, 2016, in Maui, an SUV had been reported to have fallen off a 200-foot cliff. Inside of the SUV, the Duval twins. But what led them there? The twin sisters were actually born in New York in 1978. They were originally named Allison and Ann Dado. In 2008, they moved to Florida, and this is where they opened up their yoga studio, Twin Power Yoga in West Palm Beach. And their yoga studio was a big success for them. The girls did everything together. They were inseparable. Everything from teaching classes to hanging out to the cars that they drove were also the same. They were living up their life until 2011, where a Hollywood producer approached the 2 girls for a reality TV show. For their show, their spiritual advisor, Leslie, suggested that they moved into a more luxurious apartment. It would be big enough that it would be their home, but also their yoga studio. But unfortunately, the show ended up getting canceled. This put the girls in immense amounts of debt, and since they couldn't pay for it, in 2014, they had to file for bankruptcy. This also ended up forcing them to close down their yoga studios, leaving a lot of their employees unpaid and their members super angry. This is when the two girls decided to move to Utah and they changed their names. And that is how they became Alexandria and Anastasia Duval. They were able to open up another yoga studio in Utah, but they were still in about $150,000 worth of debt. The girls' personalities were all over the place. They were known for being alcoholics and always getting drunk and even starting messes at restaurants and different locations. They also had a lot of run-ins with the laws because of their behavior. The two girls were even involved in a car accident that police officers had to go to. The officer stated that the twins fought with the officers and each other. He stated there was also hair pulling involved between the both of them. In 2015, they ended up leaving Utah and went to Hawaii on a religious quest, which didn't last long because on Christmas Eve, the girls were arrested due to their alcohol-induced disorderly conduct. In 2016, still in Hawaii, the girls ended up meeting two men. They started dating them, and they all four moved into a very spacious location in Hawaii. At the end of May, Anastasia had planned a camping trip with her boyfriend Federico. At the last moment though, they were joined by Alexandria and Alexandria alone. And Anastasia was not happy about Alexandria third wheeling. Sometime during that trip, the two girls ended up taking a trip in an SUV alone while Federico stayed back. In his statement to police, Federico stated that the girls came back shortly, but they arrived with a bunch of alcohol. Since they were known for having an alcohol problem, Federico was not happy. Federico decided to take a walk to calm down, but when he came back, he stated the two girls were gone. Alexandria was driving and Anastasia was in the passenger seat. I'm so sorry, this is a super long story. I have to post a part 2, so I'm going to do that right now. Part 2 of the Duval twins. Witnesses in the trial stated that they saw the SUV speed up and take a sharp left, which caused the car to crash down the cliff, which was 200 feet high. Alexandria survived, but her sister Anastasia did not make it. This left the big question: was this an accidental car accident or purposely done by Alexandria? Alexandria was arrested but then was acquitted. According to authorities, there's no way Alexandria could have guessed that she was going to survive, so they marked it as a double suicide. But a bunch of witnesses came forward. A man named Chad Smith had stated that he saw them driving. They had their windows down. They were yelling with their hands up in the air, and you could tell they were fighting, and it was very aggressive. Another witness came forward stating that the woman in the passenger seat, Anastasia, was screaming for help, while Alexandria, who was driving, sounded very angry and aggressive. Another witness stated that they saw the SUV and you could tell that they sped up on purpose to go over the cliff, and that the twin on the passenger seat, Anastasia, who was the one who passed away, was pulling on Alexandria's hair and yelling for help. A Maui police officer that was in the hospital when the girls were taken there stated that Alexandria showed no compassion and had a lack of empathy, that she was hysterical but not one tear was shed for her sister. An investigation even resulted in showing that there was no sign that the brakes were pressed at all during the time of the accident. On June 2018, Alexandria was initially released because, like I said earlier, there was no proof that it was a murder. But she was rearrested on November 11th. Despite the strong case they had against her, Alexandria was once again released with no charge. So, I'm curious, what do you guys think? Do you think it was an accident? Or do you think that Alexandria was going against Anastasia, who was asking for help, and ended up committing murder? Let me know your thoughts down below. Imagine being so evil that you decide to murder someone and have their leg in your pasta for dinner. This is David Harker. He was described as the most sensitive, sweetest, kindest person that people have ever known. That was until his ex-girlfriend broke up with him and his whole life changed. He got heavy into alcohol and started becoming obsessed with serial killers. His whole personality changed, and he kept bragging about how he had murdered a woman named Julie. This was 31-year-old Julie Patterson from Darlington, England. Poor Julie had had a very rough life. Her childhood was no good. She suffered a lot of trauma growing up, but despite all of the bad things that had happened to her, she thrived on being the person that could put a smile on different people's faces, even if she felt like hell inside. She was a mother of 4, but unfortunately, she suffered from alcoholism. So her children ended up being put up in the foster system. Fortunately, she did have one good thing in her life. A man named Alan Taylor, who ended up being the love of her life, and they had been together for such a long time. They lived together and they had a good relationship. In April of 1998, Julie went out for a drink at a pub, which was very common for her to do. The following day, when Julie did not arrive, Alan was unnerved but he didn't think too much of it, considering that there had been times where she'd be gone for almost a week. This time though, it was different. Julie never missed any appointments, but she was missing appointments and she still hadn't come home. So he reported her to authorities. She was marked as a missing persons and the authorities instantly got on it. Days turned into weeks of searching, but there was still no sign of Julie. Finally, they posted a photo of Julie in the cover of a newspaper. And just like they were hoping for, a witness came forward. This led authorities to a home where they found a trash bag. Trigger warning for violence. There was a foul smell coming from it, and they discovered a rotting flesh inside of it, particularly a torso. That torso belonged to Julie. A group from a local pub mentioned David, and David became their prime suspect. So authorities got a search warrant and instantly showed up to David's flat. When they got in, there was a trail of blood leading from the stairs down to the basement. There was also a trail of blood in the flat's kitchen, where there were 6 large hooks hanging from the ceiling. In the basement, they saw something that came out of a horror movie. There was blood everywhere and a bunch of Julie's belongings. David said that he met Julie at a park and they immediately got along. He said they went on with their night, but suddenly something in his head clicked and he ended up strangling her with her tights that she was wearing. He then chopped her body into pieces and put it into his homemade pasta. He then slept with the remains of her dead body. Even though he was sentenced to life in prison, he showed absolutely no remorse, and he refuses to tell her family members where her arms, legs, and head are. In fact, he even writes taunting letters to the family. He even smiled and thanked the court after he was sentenced. And the worst part is that he still has ability of parole. Julie's brother still fights and demands to know where the rest of her body was buried. Imagine massacring some of your wife's family during Christmas Eve's dinner because she filed for divorce. On Christmas Eve 2008, Alicia Ortega and Jose Ortega were hosting Christmas in their home in Covina, California. Their 5 children were there, as well as their children's families, like wives, husbands, kids. In total, there was about 30 people in the home celebrating Christmas. At around 11:30 p.m., just around the time everybody was wrapping up to head out, the doorbell rang. 8-year-old at the time, Katrina, went to answer the door, and a Santa Claus was at the other side. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, Santa Claus pulls out a gun and shot Katrina in the face. He was armed with a homemade flamethrower, semi-automatic rifle, and 3 9mm guns. He then went crazy and just started shooting all around the home. He ended up killing 9 victims in total. Here is a list of all of the victims' names. The so-called Santa Claus was Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, who was Sylvia's husband. Now, Bruce was a very sketchy character. He had told Sylvia that he had no kids from any other marriage, even though he completely lied and did, though he neglected them. He wouldn't have a joint account with Sylvia and just wasn't a good person or husband altogether. But for some reason, it really shocked him when Sylvia asked for a divorce. After massacring her family, it's suspected that Bruce was going to try to escape to Illinois, but was too badly injured when he actually hurt himself after he set their home up on fire, and instead drove to his brother's home where he ended up fatally shooting himself. Now, out of about 30 people, Bruce ended up murdering 9 of them. He had about 3 people that were injured, including Katrina, who was shot in the face, but she survived. And the rest of them were able to escape because they were more towards the back end of the home. Honestly, I'm shooketh with this case. I don't understand. I will never understand why people just get so mad when they get broken up with or divorced. Like, what are you doing? There's a lot more details to this case, but I didn't have enough time to cover it because the most that I'm really offered is 3 minutes, and I didn't want to do multiple parts. So if you're more curious about this case and want to know more, do some research. There's so many articles and YouTubers, I believe, that have covered this case, if not podcasts. But yes, it is insane and tragic and just shocking. Let me know your thoughts down below.